Sinead Rafferty, Head of Investment Sales at CFS. First of all, Sinead, thank you very much for participating in the Insight Network's Alternatives Symposium.
Thank you, James. Appreciate you having me.
It's a pleasure. Sinead, the Alternatives Symposium explores a number of themes, including the growth in the number of alternative investment solutions that advisors can consider. Is this an exciting trend, or should there also be a high element of caution associated with this growth in the ability of advisors to gain exposure to alts?
Yeah, look, if we kind of dial it back, 20 years ago, the opportunity set for investors in the alternative space was really all things private equity mostly, and then some hedge funds and some kind of more niche strategies. And what we've seen in particularly the last 5 to 10 years is just a proliferation of investment opportunities that are available, not just to the institutional space, but now into the wealth market. And with any new thing that maybe is less familiar, people do need to be cautious and make sure that they're thinking about what role it might play in portfolios. Is it something that, you're looking for an income and therefore it sits on the defensive side? Or is it kind of something that whereby you're looking to add different sources of diversification from the growth perspective? And like anything, I guess it is all about making sure that you're partnering with groups that can kind of help you achieve those objectives. So I would say within the alternative space, much more so than traditional asset classes, it is finding those right partnerships.
Do the prevailing macro conditions lend themselves to larger alternatives allocations? And extending that, what are some of the trends you're seeing across the investment landscape given those prevailing conditions?
Look, I think what we're seeing is that there is a structural change among most allocators, and so alternatives plays a meaningful role in most portfolios these days. Where we're starting to see the macro play a part is more around where people are allocating at different times in the cycle, and obviously, adding to that, what types of clients they have, what is their investment time horizon, what is their appetite for liquid assets, if that's kind of types of alternatives that they're investing in. So the macro is absolutely part and parcel of where you want to play within alternatives, but I think it's just such a broader range of opportunities than maybe it has been in the past, and therefore, if you're allocating, which many people are, circa 20% of investors' money into this space, then it is something whereby it's more of a tactical play.
Sinead, you mentioned liquidity, and that's of course one of the big arguments around private markets, that illiquidity lends itself to long-term and patient capital. So does that naturally give an investor like a super fund an advantage over other types of investors?
Yeah, before I get into that, I think it's important to recognise that, many of the reasons why you want to invest in alternatives is because it comes with an illiquidity premium, and therefore that is an extra source of returns that investors can potentially harvest by investing in, say, for example, the more growth end of the market, such as private equity and venture capital and those sorts of assets. And so therefore that can be a really important reason for investing in this space. Now, in terms of, your question around institutional versus kind of maybe, the wealth space, what you see in the institutional space is that often they're kind of forced to invest in these parts of the market because the sheer amount of money that they're managing. And so if you think about the really large super funds here in Australia, like allocating to small caps, as an example, just becomes almost impossible in the Australian marketplace. And so therefore, to add additional layers of diversification into their portfolios, firstly, they're going global. And secondly, they're trying to do more and more in the private markets or alternative space. And even within that, to try and give money to a manager is often quite difficult, and so they're having to go like direct investments. They're buying a toll road, they're buying a airport somewhere globally, and so it is quite a different proposition for the institutional space relative to the wealth market. And so while there are positives and negatives to how you can play, and obviously the institutional space can negotiate pretty hard in the kind of fees that they're willing to pay. But for the wealth market, it actually, if you consider it from a positive perspective, there's actually a whole load of investment opportunities that just aren't available to those institutional investors, that therefore wealth investors can really take advantage of, and they can partner with the best of breed type of managers who, have capacity for wealth investors that they just can't offer to the institutional space.
One of the themes the Alternatives Symposium is hearing, Sinead, is that there are so many different strategies across the alternatives universe, and the menu's broadening all the time. So where do you think, from the point of view of advice practices, that they should devote their greatest attention?
Yeah, look, there's no doubt that there's a huge range of opportunities, and you only have to look offshore and see some of the managers who previously would have had no presence in Australia that are now looking at our superannuation system and saying, yes, that is a market that we want to explore, and we want to offer investment opportunities to Australian investors. So I think it's really important to do your due diligence when you're considering investing in one of these sorts of managers. You want to make sure that the investment team has a really strong track record in this space. You want to make sure that their team is sufficiently resourced for the type of asset class that they're investing in, that they've lived through cycles. You want to see a lot of grey hair on the page. And so you also want to think about the types of fees that they're charging, the types of product structures, and that they truly have expertise in investing in that kind of sleeve of the alternative space, because really success breeds success in alternatives. And often what we see is that managers can manage to achieve really strong long-term returns for investors, because it is really about relationships in this space. It is as much about having the right relationships as it is about choosing the right investments. And so if you're not investing with the managers who have those kinds of relationships, then it is going to detract from that risk-adjusted return you can achieve for your clients.
You have experience across both institutional and wealth markets. So what guidance would you have for advisors who are looking at the way institutions use alternatives and they're seeking to replicate that in their allocations in the wealth and the advised worlds?
Yeah, look, I think, in the institutional space, there is a massive appetite, as I mentioned already, for alternatives. And, some funds might have like 40, 60, even 80% of their allocation into this space. And truly, that may not be appropriate in the wealth space. But we are starting from a pretty low base here in Australia relative to maybe other jurisdictions. And so, there's an education piece that needs to happen here. So, I think education takes place in terms of talking to allocators, in terms of maybe it's the research team within an advice business, the investment committee, whoever those key decision makers are. But then it's education to the advisor, and then from there it's education to the client. And so there's this whole piece of work that needs to happen before people feel really comfortable that they understand what they're investing in, and most importantly the risks that they're taking on. And so, while I think there is increasing appetite here for these types of strategies, I think it will be something that happens incrementally, and we are starting to see a massive uptick in some parts of the market, but there are still a huge number of clients who don't have any allocation to this space at all, and it is an important diversifier in portfolios. And so I think the runway is still huge, but we are starting from a relatively low base here, and I think that education piece, I can't emphasize it enough how important that is.
Sinead Rafferty of CFS, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, James.